and welcome to another edition of Power the Pen. I am LaWanna Bradford, and I am so excited because not only is it Women's History Month, but I have an amazing guest, Dana Rubin, and we are going to be aligning with this month's theme, Women's History theme, which is Women Who Tell Our Stories. Dana is a woman's voice advocate. She's a consultant, a speaker, and a speechwriter. And she has a passion for elevating women's voices. And she believes that women should speak their voices in order to ignite change in the public square. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. She has created the Speaking While Female Speech Bank, which is the largest online archive of speeches of women from around the world. Believe it or not, over 1,800 speeches are found there. And I'm excited to have her here to talk about her new book, which is Speaking While Female, 75 Extraordinary Speeches by American Women. And I will bring her to the stage. How is it going, Dana?
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. It's so nice to be with a fellow book lover and history lover.
Thank you for coming. I know your schedule has been busy, I'm certain. So this book, what actually I first learned about you on Women in the Arena. I heard the podcast, and I was fascinated by the breadth and depth of study that I can only imagine that it took for you to compile these books. And when I was doing some research of your backstory, I saw that you had uncovered 1,000 speeches, but somehow you were able to distill it down to 75. Can you tell me, first of all, our listening audience, a little bit about your journey and into the discovery of this particular work, and why now, and why is it so important for you to amplify the voices of women who've since gone, but those who are still among us?
Well, sure. Those are several questions packed into there. So I'll try to be brief. But first of all, I am a speechwriter. I do some speaking. I do coaching. I lead workshops in public speaking. And I began to be aware about 5 or 6 years ago of the extent to which women's voices have been completely overlooked in history. If you ask anybody who are famous speakers in American history, they're going to rattle off the names of men. They're going to talk about people like Patrick Henry and Abe Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and JFK and MLK and RFK and Ronald Reagan and Billy Graham, and scarcely any really appreciation that women have been speaking. If a woman's name does come to mind, it's almost always Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton. Sometimes it's a Sojourner Truth, but I mean, people just don't appreciate that women have been speaking. So I became aware of this some years ago. I am every year I have the honor of being a judge for a speech writing contest. And I just got so fed up some years ago when I would see every speech would have a quote by Winston Churchill. And I thought, yes, he was a great orator, a great personage in history during World War II. I appreciate him, but every speech would quote him. And I'd like, why are they looking to this British statesman as a source of authority? So that's where I started the question, why not women speakers? Where are all the women speakers?
Your collection, your anthology, goes from 1637 to 2021. That's a big swath of history. And what I want to know is, how did you find these speeches? Because I can only imagine, rewind, who was recording these speeches back then for women?
Well, how I found them is through a lot of sleuthing, like detective work. First of all, I looked in the traditional sources. I looked at speech anthologies. I looked at collections. I looked at historical survey books, but they were limited. And then I just started researching. When I started out, just for example, I knew nothing about the deep tradition of indigenous women speakers in America. By the hundreds, Indigenous women have spoken out, in their communities before the United States was as a country. And I also knew almost nothing about the many, many hundreds of itinerant preachers, Black women and white women in various denominations, evangelical women, free will Baptists, Quakers, congregations, women who traveled all over the country on the back roads and preached to mixed audiences, to Blacks, to whites, to Indigenous people, to prisoners. I knew nothing about this vast history because we don't have a lot of record of it because these women's words weren't captured. So I began to look in the historical record. I looked in newspapers. Old newspapers are a great source. And also old books, out of print books. You can get a lot of them on archive.com. And also you can go into Google Books. A lot of these sources have been digitized in the last decade or so. And so they're available. Also old journals, old conference records where stenographers showed up and took down what people said. In general, most of what women said we don't have recorded. We don't have a record of it. But here and there you can find them. And when I find speeches by women that shed some light on American situation or open up doors to understanding women's lived experience in a new way in America, I feel like I've landed a hole in one. I feel like that's golden because a little insight, a little aperture can open up a whole expansive world of understanding. And it's very exciting.
I totally agree. And as you said, even though we don't have a lot captured, these 75 really give you a glimpse into the lived experiences, what was going on from the advocacy and what the different women's rights, right? We don't realize from birth control how far back that went.
Oh yeah, back to
You
that.
know, we talk about suffrage, right? But there were so many more points of advocacy. I think about, and I don't know if your book captures. Oh my goodness, my mind just went to Keller, Helen Keller.
Oh, of course.
So
Helen Keller
with
was
disability rights.
yes. In the speech that I included, she talks about disability rights. She talks about blindness. But Helen Keller was a fierce socialist on the verge of being a communist, back in the 20s and the teens. And she also spoke out for workers' rights. She spoke out for women's rights. She spoke out for suffrage, the women's vote. So she really cut a swath through a lot of themes in American history that have resonated through the ages. Helen Keller gave hundreds of speeches all over the globe. And when you think about the fact that she never actually heard a human voice. Well, she was a little girl when she lost her hearing and her sight. So she had a hard time replicating the human voice and was always very self-conscious about it all her life. She knew that she was hard to understand, but she stood up and she spoke anyway. And that took incredible presence, incredible sense of self-possession and sense of mission, really. She was determined that people would hear her, and especially little children who were disabled, that they would see her as a role model.
In your review of all of these women and their words, their spoken words, how do you feel by this anthology now getting into the hands of many women and young girls around the world? How do you hope that it will help to shift the narrative and empower us to realize that we stand on some mighty shoulders, right? Our voices aren't new. We're echoing what's been coming down from the ages.
That's right. And I think in a very real sense, you're right. We build on ideas that have been expressed before, and it's very empowering. I'll tell you, there are a couple ways that I think it really matters. One is that it helps us to have an accessible past. Accessible meaning you can click online, you can open a book, and you can see it. You don't have to go searching for it. An accessible past, and it is inspirational and motivational. It just is. I always, think that if my book is on a bookshelf in a home or in a library and a little girl walks by And she doesn't even pull that book off the shelf, but she just walks by and sees the spine where it says speaking while female. That gives her a message that women's voices matter. So that's what they mean when they talk about representation matters. But there's a couple of other ways in which I think this collection also makes an impact. I think we tend to be very short-sighted and ahistorical, and we tend not to realize that in prior times, things weren't as good as they are now for women. Just think, even none of us would want to go back even 10 years before the Me Too movement. So when we look back and we see what these women faced, and we realize the progress that we've made as a society and a culture since then, and we realize that we've made progress because these women spoke out. It's because they used their voices and spoke out that we have the world that we live in today. That helps us to appreciate that the world that we occupy now doesn't have to be this way. When we see things we want to change, and we all know there's a lot of things to change, whether it's governance, our democracy, our environment, warfare, all the things that we want to change, we can do it. We can do it, and we can see that we can do it because these women did it. So I think in a very profound way, it imbues all of us with a sense of possibility and agency for the power of our own voices.
Yeah, I agree. I often hear women say, well, why should I say anything? It's not going to matter. It won't make a difference. What if these women had thought that? What if Susan B. Anthony had said that when it comes to suffrage, and all the other women who were around her? Because she wasn't the lone voice, even though she's one of the most spotlighted voices, but she wasn't the lone one who was crying for the need to have our voice recognized in the vote. Unfortunately, she didn't live to see it, but
right. And the way I think about it is that because they spoke then, we can speak now. Because they spoke, we are able to, and therefore we have the obligation to. It's a privilege and a right and an obligation.
I want to get your take on this, because what I'm finding in the younger generation coming up, so your Gen Zers, in my opinion, they appear to be more aware and more in tune with their voice, and they're not afraid to speak their stance. Like my niece, she is 17, and during George Floyd's murder, she asked me. She said, "I'd like to go and join, join the movement." And I said, "Do you understand what you're doing and why?" And she was very, very aware. So this is, 2 years ago. She's 15, and I had to ask myself, would I have been that motivated at 15? Or would I have just said, okay, I don't know. I think they're far more, again, self-aware and really wanting to be instruments of change. I hear that a lot among the young.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a couple things going on. One is that we are more politicized. We live in a much more politicized environment now than when we were younger. That's one thing. And for good or ill, there's pluses to it, and I can also see some negatives to it. But everything is hyper politicized now in a way that's divisive, and I think not good for our society. But it is clear to me, because of the work that I do as a coach and leading workshops and going into companies, it is clear that younger people are more vocal. They do have more confidence. And I think that's all for the good. I think they have less inhibitions. They realize their place. They have more moxie. They don't mind being controversial. And I think that's all for the good. Nevertheless, I still think that more women than men have trouble doing that. In aggregate, not every young woman or woman of any age, not every man, but in aggregate, it is still harder for women for a whole host of reasons. It's harder because women don't have as much experience. And obviously, the more experience you have, the better you get at it. That's just a fact. But it's also true that even today, even for younger women, they still bear a disproportionate share of caregiving. and it is not a level playing field in the workplace. So as long as that's the case, it's not as easy for women to step forward and use their voices. We still get criticized more than men for our clothes, our hair, our voices. Do we speak too high? Do we speak too low? That much we know. And as long as that's the case, it's still harder for women of any age. But I think you're absolutely correct. Younger women are more vocal, and I think it's fabulous to see. I really welcome it, and it makes me happy. I hope that one day we don't need coaches that focus on women's voices anymore. They'll be obsolete, which would be great.
One of the things that I know from women at the turn of the 20th century, there was a big push about pay equity. Fast forward now, because the International Women's Theme is embracing equity. We are focused on still the pay inequity. What are your thoughts about the continuation of these issues that have been amplified over and over again? And we see change, but really not to the degree that I would think we would see fast forward 100 years.
Yeah, I wish I had some special insight in that. I really don't. It's just infuriating, and I see a lot of posts in my social feeds now about, gender pay gap. But one thing that I can say from a historical point of view, that I see women in the mid 19th century talking about this. In the 1850s and 60s, women talking about the fact that they're doing the same amount of work. They want to be paid the same as men. So it is infuriating, and I don't have a secret sauce for curing it, except that women need to speak up and let their employers know, let their supervisors and bosses know that they won't stand for it. And in a tight workplace, it does work to our benefit because there are more jobs available. So women have a little more latitude to move around. But that, for a lot of women in a lot of jobs, especially at the lower end of the pay scale, these women are really up against a very hard ceiling. And it's how many women in America are making minimum wage? It's terrible. Minimum wage is just, it's clearly not enough to support yourself and support a family. So I don't have a policy recommendation. The only recommendation is to use your voice.
Agreed. One question I want to ask you is, your book really is a snapshot of the face of America, right? From women of all backgrounds, ethnicities, experiences, religious backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that so important for you to make sure that you were really capturing a representative sample of what America is today?
When I started out, I don't know. I'm a big believer in diversity as a principle. I think diverse voices produce better results, diverse conversations yield, variegated points of view. I really do. I innately believe that, but I wasn't as aware of the diversity of voices in American history until I started really working on this book and learning about it. And when I learned about it, it seemed obvious that this book would be organized that way, because I learned about the indigenous women that have been speaking up. I learned about all of the Black women in America that have been speaking up. I learned about the Hispanic women, the Asian American women. It was just obvious that this is the face of America. And when you talk about diversity, I also have a speech by the first testimony to Congress by transgender woman in 1866, and in Memphis, Tennessee. And I have women speaking out for lesbian rights, lesbian in 1972. That was the terminology. And for neurodiversity, I have Temple Grandin, and I have Judy Heumann, who just passed away a week ago, speaking out for disability rights. This is the face of America. And diversity wasn't always valued in our history, but it is today. And when you're wearing that lens, a truer portrait of who makes up America and who spoke in America emerges. So of course I wanted to reflect that.
Yeah, I love that. Of all, and you don't have to just pick just one, but I think I read something that the question that was asked to you, if you could take a walk through history, who would you like to walk with? And you named three, and I'm going to pick one. We're going to go rewind time a little bit. You mentioned Sojourner Truth. And for those of you who do not know, she was an author, she's an abolitionist, she was a runaway slave. So much more richness about her, but why her?
Sojourner Truth she was undeniably a brilliant woman, and she couldn't read or write. And you can find online what her handwriting looked like when she wrote her name. She couldn't read or write, but she was so powerful as an advocate, as a speaker for human rights, for women's rights, for the rights of enslaved people, for the whole human condition. And she traveled around the United States, often by herself, like those itinerant preachers that I told you about, going door to door, sleeping rough. I mean, sleeping in barns or sleeping. She would just knock on doors because she felt called. She had a calling. In fact, her name wasn't Sojourner at birth. It was Isabella Baumfree, but she took the name Sojourner when she became an evangelical, because she felt like she was sojourning the word of God. And she also, as a public speaker, she supported herself and supported her sojourn and travels and speaking by public speaking fees, by selling. She would sell a carte de visite, a little postcard with her image, and she would sell her autobiography. So there she is, a jobbing speaker. I mean, I hang out with a lot of speakers today, and they all talk about selling merchandise from the back of the room. Sojourner Truth was doing it. So on so many different levels, she is an American inspiration. She really was. And I'll tell you something else really interesting about her speech that she's most famous for, Ain't I a Woman, which she delivered at a women's rights conference in Akron, Ohio in 1851. The version that we have come to know throughout American history, it's been reprinted in hundreds of times. It's been recited probably in hundreds of school recitals. Children have memorized it, is not the accurate version. That version was made to sound like a Black woman of the South, in the vernacular, in the language of the cadences of the South. But Sojourner Truth was from Ulster County, New York, upstate New York. She would have spoken originally a form of Dutch, Low Dutch, and also English. So she certainly never said those words. So in the book, I have two versions of the speech side by side, one and then the other. So students can see both of them and see them side by side and come to appreciate not to take anything for granted, that we should always be questioning. And it took a scholar about, about 30 years ago to really take a hard look at these documents and say, something's not right with this, and point out to the world that there was a big misconception about Sojourner Truth's voice as we had come to know it.
Yeah, and that's the first time I heard that, because I can hear, that speech being said over and over again, and I do hear that Southern dialect.
Ain't I a woman?
Right.
She would have said, ain't I a woman? But the person who like printed that version and promulgated it knew what she was doing in a way, because she used that phrase over and over. Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? I think it appears 3 times in the speech. And that's a very powerful, trick or tool that speech writers and speakers use when they repeat a phrase over and over. And it was very powerful. It stuck.
Yes.
It stuck. It was wrong, but it stuck.
So I have a question, and in this, you can give some tips to individuals who are out there who are emerging speakers. And obviously your background as a speechwriter, you were able to come through and glean which were the most powerful and impactful speeches. So if you were to talk to someone today, me included, what would you say that our message needs to convey to be considered a great and impactful speech?
Well, first of all, it needs to be a message that you believe in. It has to be something that you feel like the fire in your belly about, because when you feel that way, you're going to give a far more powerful speech. You can't take someone else's point of view. You can't adopt a line of argument, it has to come from you. That may be obvious. But then I would say that it has to be something that has a vision attached to it. It's really important for audiences to be able to look ahead and see the possible world, not just the problems of the world that we're in, but the possibilities of the world to come. If you do that in your speech, you identify, the issues today that you're on fire about, and you tell your audience where they could be and give them some mechanism or some means to be there. That's the ingredients for a powerful speech. And that's true whether you're a politician and you're on the political stump and you want to be in office. It's true whether you are testifying before Congress and you want legislation to be adopted. It's true whether you're at a business conference and you're speaking out for some business strategy or plan. It's also true, by the way, if you're at a funeral and you're giving a eulogy. Just think about it. What do you want at a eulogy? You want your audience, the mourners who've come there, to think about this person who's passed away in a more hopeful way, hopefully in a comforting way. You have a message attached to that. You want to send them off feeling comforted or energized or in the right mood to memorialize this person and to carry their ideals forward. There's always a future implied in a powerful speech.
Thank you. Thank you for that tip. With this book, what is your hope? Because this is a huge legacy that you've built, and I know you have a community around it as well. Yes. So
not that I'm proud of it.
You should be very, very proud. What do you hope will happen?
I really hope, I have a lot of hopes, but one of the big ones is I would really like this book to be in libraries across America. I want women and girls, everyone really, but especially women and girls, to have it accessible, to be able to use it in their classroom assignments, to be able to flip through it and see the true history of women's speech. I want teachers in high schools and in universities and college settings to have this book, to be able to use it alongside their standard texts that completely overlook the voices of women. And I want it to be in households where there are little girls, where their daughters and granddaughters and nieces present. So it really is a book for across the board. It's for the home environment, the school environment, and the educational environment. I really think that it does something that no other anthology has done. There have been a few other women's speech anthologies, and I always call them out and celebrate them. They're all welcome. We could use more of them. But this is the only one that really makes this chronological argument from 1637 until, well, the most recent speech in the book is 2021 to the present, essentially, that women's voices have been critical to the founding of the nation that we live in, and that going forward, women's voices will be critical to the world that we want to occupy.
I love that. So tell us, from your very first author or speech in the book to the last, who are these two women? Who are the bookends in the book?
Oh, the first speech is by Anne Hutchinson, and she was an immigrant from Britain, and she came here with the Puritans. She came by boat across the Atlantic, and she lived in the Puritan colony on the Shawmut Peninsula, which is what we think of as Boston now. And the Puritan colony was essentially a theocracy run by men who were religious leaders. And she was very spiritually minded, and she would go to the sermons on Sundays and go back to her house and explicate the sermons, talk about the sermons. She started delivering sermons herself or interpretations of the scripture in her home, in her living room, in her home. And there would be women there, and then there would be men there. And so she was speaking to a mixed audience. And then the leaders of the community just thought that was a step too far, and they put her on trial, and they convicted her of heresy, and they kicked her out. They banished her and her family from the colony. She had to go from Boston down to Rhode Island and essentially here to New York. But I mean, essentially, Anne Hutchinson's crime was using her voice. And in the trial, the excerpt that I have in the book is an excerpt from her trial. We have it from the trial records in which she said she was called by God to speak. So the crime was using her voice. Mm-hmm. And so that's the beginning. Of course, that was even pre-colonial period in the Puritan era. And then the most recent one I have, 2021, is by a woman named Bina Venkataraman. And she is an Indian American. She was born here, but her parents came to this country from the subcontinent, from India. And she's just become an op-ed writer for the Washington Post. She was at the Boston Globe. And she gives a commencement address at UCSC, Southern California. And she talks about her experiences, how she found her voice as a journalist at the Boston Globe. But one of the reasons I included that speech, I'll tell you, it is a great speech. She talks about how she came up against Teddy Kennedy as a reporter, and how she found the courage to stick to her guns and stand up for her reporting. But the real reason I included that speech is that at the end, she said something that really moved me. She was giving advice to the graduates at UCSC, and she said, don't worship your heroes to the extent that you put them on a pedestal. Essentially, she said, everybody has clay feet. And she said, even a great, brilliant scientist could have been a eugenicist. And it's so true about women who changed American history with their voices, whether it's Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist, but you cannot tell the history of women's speech in America without Margaret Sanger and without giving her credit for the extraordinary doors that she opened for American women by campaigning for birth control. You can't separate the individual and take one part and not take the other. It was all of a whole, and you have to see people in a complex way. It's also true of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a number of other women in the collection who primarily advocated for white women's rights in the suffrage campaign and didn't include women of color. But it doesn't mean that we have to leave them out of the history books entirely. What we have to do is see these women in their context and understand that everybody was in their own time frame dealing with their own pressures, and we may not agree with the choices that they made, but they are complex individuals, and they at least deserve to be seen for the good they did and for the things that they did that weren't good.
Yeah, I love that. And it's one of the reasons why I had this platform, because Power of the Pen is designed to spotlight women authors, but also any works that are designed to help elevate women in all of our beauty, all of our genius. And I really appreciate you coming on today just to share about this amazing book. I want to put it here, Speaking While Female, 75 Extraordinary Speeches by American Women. And before we sign off, Donna, what lasting words would you like to leave for the listening audience?
Oh, well, to everybody who has a young woman in their life, please encourage them, buy the book or go to the speech bank at speakingwhilefemale.co and make sure the young woman in your life knows that her voice matters and that she can speak out, whether she's doing a speech contest in elementary school or whether she's in the college level and is on the speech team or the debate team, or whether, like your niece, she knows that she can go to a protest march and use her voice. It's so important for their futures and for the future, really, I believe, for the future of our nation.
Thank you. And we want to, again, thank you so much, Dana Rubin, for coming and sharing your perspective, your collection, this beautiful anthology. I want to make sure I get a copy so that I can read and just be informed about all the amazing voices that are out there that have been hidden. I don't want to say silenced because they were never silent, but have been hidden from our awareness, our ears. And I want to just remind everyone about women's history. And I want to do this cutaway before we close. Thank you again, Donna, to our listening audience. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Power the Pen. Remember that in life and in business, when your vision intersects with opportunity, success is inevitable. But success doesn't come without being willing to stand in your authenticity, in your truth, and lifting your voice. It's all about the power of the pen. Until next time, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.